emphasize by Gianluca to talk about also startups, because I am from both worlds, from university as well as from a company that I founded. And it's always wise to listen to people who make mistakes and to learn from them. So I guess I will try to put in also something about founding and keeping alive a startup company. So when you finish your master degree and you feel you are inventive, then you think you have a couple of choices, typically which can be put into these three, say, storylines. You can seek your university career, or you can become a startupist, or you can go for an established company and become an employee. And you may think there is a solid recall between these careers, and that you need to decide when you are finished with your master degree. Easy. Actually, I don't advise you to go for the startupist career right from when you finish your master degree, because it's going to end up by most likely going to end up as a non-success story. Actually, for startups, the statistics goes that 90% of startups fail within 1 year, so the failure rate is quite high. But definitely it will be a good experience when you're studying. There aren't any recall between these careers and career lines, so you can switch. And what typically happens is that you start your university career and go through from graduate teacher to seek for a PhD, then you become lecturer, and you build some research group, and you become the leader of that research group. Then eventually you end up like being a professor, first associate professor, and then eventually if you have some managerial capabilities, you become the head of department, dean, ideally also one day chancellor, and then you typically are at the end of your career and you become emeritus professor, and in the best case you win Nobel Prize, so this is your career. But typically people within this area go and try to build their startup because they gather enough overview in their field and know what's missing in the industry, and they start a startup. They start with an idea, but idea isn't enough. You need also to find some partners. Then you build some business plan and try to go to pitching contests where you compete with other pitches, and when you are successful, you find investor. And then you establish your startup, start building your team, you hire employees. Typically the difference between partners and employees is that partners are prepared to work for nothing, from pure enthusiasm for some time, but then when but for the employees, they want to get paid from the day one that they work for it. Then you go through your R&D efforts, and at the end you have some product or some solutions. That's maybe when we talk about biomedical startup. And then you sell all that work to a big company, and you become a millionaire, and again, your life is sort of over. That's typically, again, not the case, because when you are being sold to a big company, then you still have to stay with them for a couple of years to actually make that new product work in real life in large scale. And then you become not typically not an employee, but a lower manager or something like that. Ideally, then you go through middle management to become some sort of something O, like CSO, CEO, etc. And in the best case, you become a partner, and if it's a good company, then you become a rich fine. Okay, so who am I? I'm a molecular biologist, so I don't understand very well. I was invited to speak to you, but anyway. I'm a teacher at the Faculty of Natural Sciences and head of genomics and bioinformatics at Comenius University. And also I'm a founder and chief scientific officer of that small business called Geneton. And I'm also an author of a clinical test that I will be talking about. So back to that scheme, this is how my life looks like, or my career. Till this point, so I really am throughout all these domains, so to say, of the industry. And I have to say that there are a lot of synergies. There's a lot of effort and work, of course, but also a lot of synergies that make many things happen. So what is Geneton? Geneton was founded in 2006, when we called it a startup. Currently, can't call it startup because we are alive for, how much is it? It's 16 years. We founded it in the wrong phase, I have to say. So we were PhD students at that time. All of us still are scientists. We have some publication record, and we have a guy that's becoming a scientific star in our country. But the problem was that not just that we were PhD students at that point, but also that we didn't have the standard motivation for starting a company. Because we started the company after taking some courses in the first incubator project in Slovakia. So it looked wise to found the company, but then we stopped holding a minute. What are we actually going to do? So we were looking for some topic, and that's the wrong way around, at least what books about startups say. And all the other bad ingredients were there, so we were busy taking incubator courses where they were teaching us how to lead 100 people, teams, and stuff like that, but that's not the case in a small startup company. We did some housekeeping stuff like paternity testing, but we had no money, we had no employees, we had no equipment, which is not too bad, not too good when you are trying to do some biomedical research and development. And we are also quite busy with our PhD work, and we didn't have the right topic at that point. But soon after that period, we found a good topic, which was growing in the biomedical research field, and that was so-called topic of non-invasive prenatal testing for fetal chromosomal errors. At that point, it wasn't a solved problem, so it seemed wise to start with that. What is it based on? It's based on so-called cell-free fetal DNA analysis. It was in 2007, so 1 year after we founded the company, we came across a paper which said that Dennis Lowe in 1997 discovered fetal DNA in maternal circulation and in relatively high amounts. So we made a decision, not on the scientific board of our company, because there wasn't any, but while taking beer with friends, some of them were pregnant, they said this would be interesting. And so we started with this topic. And in 2007, I also won a grant for SMEs, and we were able to finance some primary experiments in this field. And soon after that, 1 year after that, we introduced a blood test for determination of fetal sex. This was a real-time PCR-based method. It was relatively easy and not very expensive to do, and it was very popular among pregnant women. But this wasn't our goal. This test is actually still alive and being sold by the big company that bought us. But let's talk a little bit about biology. DNA in maternal blood coming from the fetus has basically two forms. It's present either in placental cells in the maternal circulation, and this was published in 1893. But there is also this cell-free DNA, so DNA that's not present in the cell, but released from the cell. And it's of apoptotic placental cell origin. As I mentioned, Professor Dennis Lowe published this paper in 1997. This is him. He's for this discovery and a lot of further work on this topic. He is able to receive his Nobel Prize. It's likely to happen. So back to those DNA forms. Cells are very problematic for this, for any diagnostic use. There is only very few cells in maternal blood. So every 10 million cell in maternal circulation is of placental origin. And in addition, placental cells are often very aberrant, so they don't represent very well the genome of the fetus. And third thing, actually, scientists were able to discover placental cells 5 years after the birth of that baby. So they remain in the circulation for a very long time. And that's not good for diagnostic use. But, okay, let's translate the line. So actually the cell-free fetal DNA is much better for diagnostic use. So it can be isolated from a plasma fraction of the blood. Do you know what plasma is? Blood plasma? Okay, so that's the yellow part when you let blood separate. And it can be detected very early in the pregnancy, from the 8th week actually, very consistently. And it is in relatively high amounts, especially compared to the cells. It's on average, there is 10% of DNA coming from the fetus, or more precisely from the placenta. The fetal fraction also grows with the pregnancy. So further into the pregnancy, you get more fetal DNA in the blood, and of course it disappears quickly from the bloodstream. It's cleared out very quickly. 15 minutes after the birth, you cannot detect cell-free DNA. And since this was very promising, a new research field was born, non-invasive prenatal testing, and all the research behind that. And right from this paper in 1997, the main goal was defined to be able to detect Down syndrome from this cell-free fetal DNA, Down syndrome of the baby. So why is it important? Because pregnant women fear from giving birth to babies with Down syndrome, and so there are many different screening and testing procedures done to detect Down syndrome the baby. This is the most common trisomy. The average risk is 1 in 300 pregnancies. And this is around the age of 35. It grows substantially with the rising age of the pregnant woman. For example, when a woman is 49 years old, the risk is 1 in 10. So very high. And the second fear, all pregnant women fear from going for amniocentesis. There is even a worse procedure called CVS, or Korean villi sampling, which is even more risky. These two methods are called invasive because there is an invasive way how you sample for genetic material of the baby. This is a nice representation how amniocentesis is done. So basically with the needle you take the amniotic fluid, but you have to be careful not to touch the baby. And for that you use USG, so ultrasonography. So this is the idealistic picture, and this is how it looks like in practice. So this is what the doctor doing the amniocentesis sees on a very good machine. Okay, and so naturally you would expect that there is some risk associated with this procedure, and it's been quantified quite well in the literature. So the risk for the baby, for the induction of for pregnancy loss, there is 1% risk for the amniocentesis and 3% risk for CVS. Actually, CVS I think is no longer done anywhere, but amniocentesis is still carried out. They're in a very experienced clinic where they do at least 2,000 amniocentesis per year, and they have certification, and they go through a lot of courses to make it safe. The risk is lower, it's around 0.3%. But for example, in Slovakia, we do only 1,500 amniocentesis per year in the whole country. So there is no such clinic that can do this safely, so to say. And there are no statistics available. Therefore, we cannot do this procedure to all pregnant women. What we do is we do non-invasive procedures, which are called screening, because they're not very precise. The issue with screening method is that they're not very, not so sensitive and specific to detect the fetus with chromosomal error. There are different methods used, SIPS, IPS, quad, and the latest one that I will be talking about, which is called NICT. Typically, biochemical tests are carried out for these markers. In this integrated prenatal screening scheme, also ultrasonography is added, and it's done into time points. This is the one that's used in most of the countries if they didn't switch to the NIPT alone testing. And theoretically, the sensitivity is also put into the years when they were started around the globe. The detection rate for these different approaches up to the point where cell-free fetal DNA was started to be used were always under 90%. In reality, the numbers were even worse. Okay, so for example, I can speak for the numbers in Slovakia. In real life, before we started with NIPT testing, 1 in 34 amniocentesis came up negative. So 33 out of 34 amniocentesis were shouldn't have been done at all. But this was, of course, improved a lot by introducing NIPT. So the discovery was made in 1997, so you would expect to have this NIPT running from next year or so, because many groups started to work on that. But unfortunately, the first NIPT test was available in 2012. And actually, our test took 3 more years. I will explain why, to start. So why it took so long? The reasons are the following. Only 10% of the fetal DNA is of fetal origin. The rest is maternal DNA, and it's 90% on average. But the figures vary quite substantially. And when you want to detect Down syndrome, you want to look for 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of 2 copies of chromosome 21. So there are very small differences when you consider that you are only looking at these 10%. And at the time of discovery, there was no relevant technology available to be able to detect this small difference. Also, limitation was that there was only 25 copies of the whole genome of fetal origin in 1 milliliter of plasma. So to make some molecular methods then available, you would have to use 10 milliliters of blood, and taking 10 milliliters of blood from pregnant women isn't very well accepted by clinicians. And even after NIPT was introduced, physicians were quite reluctant to introduce that into clinical practice. But nevertheless, pregnant women pushed so hard that it became very trendy, and physicians changed their mind. Once again, a picture describing the problem. So this is all the fetal DNA, all the DNA in maternal blood. Depending on the chromosome, there is a difference in the sequences that you detect when, for example, sequencing is done. And this is the difference that you want to detect. So this signal on top of all the rest of the sequence. But in 2006, new technology arrived, and it was called next-generation sequencing, then still called in literature next-generation sequencing. And what it essentially was, it was a single molecule DNA fragment reader and also counter. And it was done in high counts. Currently we have from millions to billions of reads per one single sample that can be used for analysis. And it was obvious to us at that point that it's a perfect solution for Down syndrome, except that at that point it was an expensive tool, and you had to buy the machine, which was also quite expensive, especially for young research group. And of course, other groups were working on this topic, especially Dennis Long was, and he published his proof of concept paper in 2009, and from that point on there was an intensive research on commercial tests. In our case, we received our first sequencer in 2013, so we are quite many years behind test groups. You can take 2 approaches to solving this problem, to detect chromosomal error in the baby. You can do it by whole genome NIPT test, and also by amplified region NIPT test. So when you are doing the whole genome approach, you are sequencing the total DNA present in the plasma fraction that you isolate. You do typically shallow sequencing, meaning coverage is even under 1x. Then you do sequence counting with regard to the chromosome, and then you are comparing these counts with what you know about normal pregnancies and try to detect small differences in selected chromosomes. Additional information that you get with this approach is that the so-called fragment size, or you can measure the size of a fragment that you just sequence when you do variant sequencing. Different approaches when you are doing the amplified region NIPT. You select some reference and tested chromosome regions. You amplify them intensively by PCR, and you do deep sequencing. So you do tens of thousands of reads per one region. And in these regions, you look for so-called informative SNPs. Besides that DNA plasma, you sequence DNA from white cells so that you can tell the difference between mother DNA and the DNA from actually father, so the fetal DNA. And based on the numbers, you can detect trisomy. Unfortunately, none of these methods really work so well in practice, in clinical practice, because they have a big problem with fetal fraction. This is due to the PCR, which is introducing biases, which are not easily corrected for. As I mentioned, there are only 25 copies of fetal DNA in 1 milliliter of plasma, but you want to have like tens of thousands of reads for that molecule, and you can assume errors. Okay, one more slide about how this is done. So you, with the whole genome NIPT, you sequence all or total DNA in the sample, then you do mapping, then you do counting per chromosome, and then you compare the counts, and you count z-score, and you are then able to detect from a given fetal fraction whether the baby has Down syndrome or not, with high precision. Okay, so back to our story, road to so-called trisomic. This is the commercial name of that test. We started on that topic, as I mentioned, in 2007. In 2009, there was a call for project that would let us have such sequencer. Unfortunately, the financing started in 2011, and we received the first sequencer in 2013. Other groups already had a commercial test running, but the approach was such that samples from all over the world were sent to two places on this planet, to BGI in Shenzhen in China, or to Sequenom company in California. And this wasn't very convenient, and it also took a lot of time to receive the result. So we have, of course, if we wanted to work on something usable in practice, we have to think how we can change this. And our approach was to make it work on small sequencers, and so our work was focused on trying to make it work on those smaller, cheaper sequencers running small numbers of samples. And in this setup, it could be done basically in any city, a large city in any country, which would be financially feasible. Okay, so the main problem was to make a small number of reads work the same way as it was published. So instead of using 10 million uniquely mapped reads, we had to make it work for 3 million, and that's what we achieved. We achieved that by introducing some modifications to the method. Specifically, we made some simple methods to select specifically the sizes of fragments in which there was more of that fetal DNA. I will show you a slide later. Also, we started from the scratch using paired sequencing, which wasn't the standard at that point in the company. It's now standard. And we also made a lot of bioinformatics work on a new algorithm based on alpine amino distribution. And we also introduced some other bioinformatic methods. This is how that algorithm works. This is a Chinese algorithm. This is a Californian. This is the one that we developed, and it was even 15% more better for detecting trisomies compared to the published methods, to the best published method, which was by the group ZNet, while still maintaining the distribution of z-scores for normal pregnancies. This is the effect of physical size selection. It improves the z-scores for trisomic cases, but it doesn't touch so much the z-scores for normal pregnancies. We published these results, but we believe that the field is already taken over by the companies, and so that this would be our last effort. But we visited California for actually doing a technology transfer of their NIPT into our lab and started in our country. But I figured that they have an inferior test in many points. So we decided to go with our test, and coincidentally, a nice new science park was built. And since we still work with the university, we were able to be the first tenants in that science park and work on this topic, and even using then the new sequencer in Illumina XC500. Then the company was bought by a big company in our country, and this was a completely different world where you meet a lot of different levels of managers, different attitudes. But anyway, they really took seriously this NIPT test and developed it, and also made a lot of efforts in marketing and sales. We were doing such business trips on private jets, so it was quite an interesting period. Not very effective though, because partners that we visited didn't end up going for our test, but the better approach was to go for scientific conferences and make promotion there, and that worked a lot better. Okay, so when you think you have an excellent method and you are introducing it into clinical practice, then you are confronted with the real life, which brings you many borderline cases which make your method fail. And so you can count on that you will have to continue on development for a long time from the point where you think you are finished. And that's the case for us as well. We are still doing a lot of effort on development, especially fixing the borderline cases and finding solutions for them. So one of the key problems is that was at the beginning that we didn't have the measuring of so-called fetal fraction. We didn't know how many fetal DNA was in the sample. And so when you receive a negative result, that there is no trisomy in the baby, it could be also due to the fact that there isn't any fetal DNA in the sample. But since you don't measure it, you don't know. And that was one of the main first tasks to add to our test. We know that if the average amount is 10%, but it's highly variable and it varies from 0% to 30%. There is significant amount of samples which are under 4% where any scoring-based method is failing. If you don't measure, you don't know if it's false negative or true negative. Fortunately, there are different approaches to measure fetal DNA. If you are lucky enough, there is a chromosome Y which allows you to measure it relatively precisely. But this is good for half of the pregnancies. But there are also sex-independent methods to measure fetal fraction. One is based, interestingly, on measuring and having some algorithm working with fetal with fragment sizes that you sequence. You can see that there are differences between pregnancies with different levels of fetal DNA present. So if there is more fetal DNA in the sample, these smaller fragments have higher peaks, and at the same time this main large peak is dropping in signal. And when you compare those with a good algorithm, you can do an estimation of fetal fraction in your sample, regardless of the sex of the baby. Then there is there was discovered that there is a difference in the pattern of mapping between maternal DNA and fetal DNA. And using an algorithm called SeqFF, you can measure it. Unfortunately, none of those none of those tools seem to work the same way in real life as they look in the paper. But what we figured and published also was that when you combine three methods, you are really approaching 100% estimation of the correct fetal fraction. So that's how we do it. Now we combine three methods to measure fetal fraction. Okay, so how is the trisomy test doing in real life? It's really good. The sensitivity and specificity for not just Down syndrome, but all three trisomies is beyond 99%. But there are problems, of course. It's not 100%. And what really struck us was this figure, false positive trisomy 13. So we tried to find a fix for this. And we managed to find a solution and publish it in Bioinformatics. And it is based on a different view of the Z-score. You can measure and get a figure of Z-score when you consider all the sequenced reads, so both all of fetal and maternal reads. But you can also look to the area where you know there is more fetal DNA than maternal. And comparing the difference of the Z-score, you can say whether that aberration, be, for example, trisomy 13 in a mosaic form in the mother, you can detect it. So these are false positives, and you see the drop in Z-score and in that selected fetal part, and in true positives you see that the graphs are going up, making a big up. Okay, another thing. We were asked to develop this test further because it's not only, pregnancies are not only about the fear from three most usual trisomies, Down syndrome, Edwards syndrome, and PACA, but there are a lot of other aberrations that, of course, mothers don't want to see in their children. And actually, the numbers are quite high. So one big part of those are CMVs. Do you know what CMVs are? multi-number variants. These are the micro deletions and micro duplications, so not chromosomal but subchromosomal errors. And there's quite a few of those, so almost as many as the T18 plus T13. This is what came out from Trident 2 study in Netherlands, where they tested 73,000 pregnancies in 1 year. And so, of course, mothers tend to opt for such tests, which can tell them more. And that was again a task from a big company to develop tests being able to detect also CNVs. And since we were doing the whole genome approach, so we sequenced the whole genome with shallow sequencing, it was just a matter of introducing a good algorithm able to detect CNVs. And that's what we managed as well. And actually we have we are able to detect 3 megabase deletions with 90% sensitivity in pregnancies with at least 10% fetal fraction, which is actually one of the best numbers among NIB tests worldwide. Okay, back to that business storyline and startup storyline. When you have something in clinical practice, you have to make sure you are unique and also you follow some standards. And this is a completely different world. So one of the key points was to obtain CE-IVD, which we managed in 2018. And that's a lot of paperwork prepared to make your method standardized. But what was mentioned yesterday, that clinicians are conservative or something like that. This is because when you have such CE-IVD certified method, you really lock your method, and any change requires change also in the documents related to your certification, and this is a really complex and complicated process. So it's great that you can do the same thing with better algorithm, with better results, basically every 5 months or so, but this is not applicable in real life so easily. So bear this in mind. You may have a new bioinformatics method to solve a problem in a better way, in a shorter time, more easily, with less computing power needed, but it will take some time to make it work in real life. Okay, so my experience again, what were the side effects of developing this test instead of going for an existing test? So we managed to give work to quite high number of molecular biologists and bioinformaticians. It's around 30 people, full-time employed for many years now. We managed also to drop the prices of NIPT tests on our market. Before us, the tests were marketed for around 2,000 euros, later 1,000 euros, but with the introduction of our test, the cost was 350 euros, and of course mothers were able to afford it. Amniocentesis counts, where there is of course a risk of pregnancy loss due to that procedure, dropped to 1/3 of the numbers before 7 years before we started with NIPT test. Finally, Trigen test is also sold in other countries. There are also many tech transfers of our test. We managed to create many common projects between the universities, so the initial investment from the university comes back in higher numbers. Currently, there are 17 common projects, so we think we are giving back a lot to the university. And there is a lot of valuable data that can be used used for further research, and there are quite a few diploma and PhD students working on these data. So we are preparing a new generation of scientists. And there is a new spin-off idea at this point directed into oncology, because, back to that point, valuable data for research. We took all those sequenced whole genome data from NIPT test, and we combined that and aggregated them, and we were able to extract allelic frequencies for our population. So there was no genomic study run in our country so far, so this was a simple workaround. So a population genomics project for free, basically. And this can also be done in other countries easily. This is what came out. We compared a set of comparable 71,000 SNPs, and it came out as expected. Our population came close to non-Finnish European and Finnish population, quite distant from African and American population. Oncology. Just like the fetal DNA in the bloodstream of pregnant woman, tumor DNA is released to the bloodstream of a cancer patient. And since it's called circulating tumor DNA, and since tumor DNA is different from the normal DNA, when you have a good method, you can detect it. The difference can be at different levels, so it can be SNPs, it can be CNVs, it can be whole chromosomal errors, etc. But at least if there is that CNV that we detect in our test, it can be seen also in our test as well. And we have come across pregnancies where we saw such thing. This is how chromosomal profile of normal pregnancy should look like. But this is what we saw in a couple of cases. And you see there are under and overrepresented regions actually on every single chromosome that was sequenced. And this was due to the copy number instability of a tumor that was then diagnosed. The same thing was observed also in the Trident study. So out of 73,000 pregnancies, they saw 11 maternal malignancies, maternal tumors that mothers didn't know about, and they were then diagnosed in the follow-up. Okay. But since this oncology research is related to projects that are running now, and we have a pandemic period, there was a big problem with getting samples into our research. So we switched to a different topic, a topic of SARS-CoV-2. But some projects simply make more sense when they are done on the university affiliation, and this was exactly that sort of project. So since we had experience with Illumina sequencing, and we had experience with a lot of bioinformatics data analysis in different projects, we were approached by public health authority in our country to help them out with sequencing. And this is how it is done in Slovakia. So there are 24 laboratories that test for positivity of the sample, in clinical samples. And these samples are then sent to the public health authority body, where they isolate RNA and they prepare sequencing sequencing 96 well plates, which are then sent to sequencing laboratories. There are 6 involved laboratories, and the idea was to make processing unified, data processing unified and results standardized. So this is what we did. The issue was that the sequencing laboratories had different levels of experience, not only with sequencing, but especially with bioinformatics analysis. And the whole process was quite complex. So for handling such samples, you need a special biosafety laboratory of level 2 and 3, and we don't have too many in Slovakia. You have to take care of the storage of the sample not to compromise the quality of RNA. You need to do RNA isolation, and you need then to do the sequencing and handling of data and metadata. And really we have huge human resource limits in both NGS technology and in bioinformatics. And we were approached with the task of sequencing 500 samples in the first and second wave, but the need to sequence more came with, for example, the Omicron wave, when we had to upscale to 2,000 samples. Our state public health authority has problems with financing for many years, and so they have low data integration within their laboratory procedures, and they have, of course, lack of personnel, and there was lack of standardized evaluation. At the same time, media were attacking the public health authority because the speed of reporting of sequencing results was slow, and we decided to solve this problem. And we came up with an integrated information system that we couldn't call differently. We call it NARCOS. This is short for our way of saying National COVID Sequencing, and these are the letters used within that name. It has nothing to do with the flow business on the right side, but it's a tool for managing genomic survey in Slovakia for the whole country. Currently, the integration is for Illumina labs, but we have now using a different sequencing technology for this purpose. It's a web-based service which was programmed by Tomas, present in the audience. There are different roles in the whole process of sequencing, and in this system they are defined with their rights to access. Different Illumina sequencing platforms are integrated for this process, more so than what is supplied by the Illumina itself. Illumina now supports the use of their kit for only 2 sequencers, but in our country we use 5 different types of Illumina sequencers for this purpose, and we had to make it run on those as well. The key point is that we create a specific ID, which doesn't contain any personal information, and this one ID is brought across the whole process from actually putting the sample into the system down to reporting to relevant databases. And what was very important to implement batch uploading to, are you aware of GSAID probably? But for us it was important also to upload to ENA, EMBL database. And one key point was to prevent mixing the samples within how they are moved in the process. Okay, these are data flows. Maybe we can skip this slide. But basically, sample and sample PCR results are uploaded to a different information system called ES-COVID that is run by the state. And then this is under supervision of public health authority. Then selected parts of metadata are transferred automatically based on PID to the narco system. You can create plain definitions for your sequencer and then download that so-called sample sheet for running the sample. Plate IDs then associated with the sequencing run. And when the sequencing is finished in laboratories, they only upload the FASTQ files back to Narcos to FTP, and the auto-analysis is carried out basically without any need for further input from people. And then the results are evaluated by our specialists, and just by clicking their batch uploaded to GSAID and ECDC run TESI database. Okay, so I mentioned the automated run planning, which was key not to make errors in the naming of the samples. This is the structure of the narcos. This is what we developed during 3 months of this year, first 3 months or so. But it was important to make integration with that ES-COVID, which was run by the state. And just to ensure this, a different company was hired to do this stuff, and they asked 100,000 euros just to make the data and metadata being automatically transferred into Narcos. This was done by my group just out of passion. Okay, this is the pipeline which is part of the analysis manager. This is the pipeline that we use for processing FASTQ files. And we have to specifically deal with a problem of mixed samples coming from certain PCR testing laboratories. So they send us a sample, but which contain not only one virus, but also a contamination by a different variant. So it was quite hard to tweak the pipelines to be able to make a reliable or to allow good evaluation of the result. These are some views into the narco system. You can see plain definition with their IDs. When you upload the FASTQ files to the FTP, it's automatically, each FASTQ is automatically associated with the given sample. Auto-analysis is activated. Nextplate is integrated in. When this is finished, you can do the evaluation whether the code is correct. Typically it's correct, but for some problematic samples, you can do adjustments. You can go down to the level of individual reads where you can identify which sample very specifically. When there is a mixed signal at a given position, like here, you know it's a mixed sample. And then what's important for our Ministry of Health that we have Google Data Studio running on top of the results of the sequencing currently in the real time, so they can view what the situation with variants is. As you can see, we have a rising number of BA5 and BA4, which is basically the case there aren't too many hybrid cases. There are still a few, but I was expecting them to be more successful. And you can also see a regional view of our country regarding the sequence cases. There is a age breakdown for the cases, absolute numbers, relative numbers, and you can also look which laboratories contribute in what amount. My laboratory is this one, so we sequenced half of the coronaviruses in Slovakia. These are the PCR contributing laboratories. And it seems I will be finishing earlier, but I think it's not going to matter too much. Okay, so what were the effects of doing such information system? We were able to switch from 500 to 2,000 samples per week easily without the risk of big samples. The result accuracy was increased thanks to this. And also the reporting went down from 30 days to 12 days from the sample being tested to sample being uploaded to the ENAP or GSAID database. Again, real-time situation overview for the Ministry of Health is very helpful, and thanks to using this system, we were able to determine the laboratory that had an issue with sample contamination, and we introduced some procedures in the laboratory to prevent this. And finally, we will be looking financing for this activity because it wasn't the case until now for this year. Okay. This seems not to be ending with even ending the pandemic. We are modifying the NARCO system for monitoring of wastewater. We would like to introduce many other pathogens, where you only need to switch that analysis pipeline. And I would like to see such unified system running maybe for the whole planet to make a surveillance really unified for all. These are the results of sequencing of wastewater. One interesting thing, this is the B1617.2, which is the Delta variant. In clinical samples, we didn't see that after like the end of January, beginning of February, but in the wastewater, we were able to see the signal up to the point of beginning of March. So there was a delay in coherence of Delta variant in wastewater of at least 1 month. And this is in line with the publications coming out stating that virus shedding is continuing even after you have a PCR result negative from your SARS-CoV test. Okay, based on this work, I was invited to be part of the scientific advisory board for Illumina company, together with really renowned scientists from the field, including Julio de Oliveira, who was coined the most influential scientist in 2021, because he was the one who basically discovered Omicron in South Africa and reported on rising cases. So we are again in the domain of large industry, and so the role of science is really interconnected within those domains. Okay, so some take-home messages if you are considering starting your startup, do not fear to make a startup. Even if it fails, you can call it 90%. So that's what the failure rate is. But the experience is really helpful to have a different view of your work. Biotechnology startups take quite a long time and quite a lot of money to become successful, to have a finished product, for example. So bear this in mind. And the key thing is to find right people. And don't hesitate to get rid of people that are not helping out. That have different ideas and they have different plans. They will not help you with the startup too much. And think also about the people that aren't directly part of your startup, but will support you. So let's say your professor who is keen to support people doing startups. So you will find those people as well. University is a great source of talented and motivated people, and when you teach at the university, you can spot them. When you lead their diploma or PhD thesis, you can really determine if they're suitable for your startup, and then you can hire them. So you skip the part where you're testing your person for your money. It's also, if you want a successful biotechnology startup, you need to combine different specialists. That's when really unique ideas come across and the unique solutions come across. Try to choose a novel topic, so a problem that's not been solved for many years, for example, and you think you have a solution that may be a good way to go. And do not get demotivated by negative people. You will meet a lot of negative people at the beginning, especially, that will tell you it's not worth it and stuff like that. So be patient and don't get fooled. And my advice is keep synergies with the university as much as possible. This is really working. And when you want to succeed then with something that you created, you have to convince decision makers. For example, in our case, it was to convince geneticists and clinicians that NIPT is the right way to go. When I spoke about the possibility to detect Down syndrome from the blood in 2007, I was giving a talk at a genetics conference in our country. Then one leading geneticist stood up and said, God save us from this technology. But a year later, he also contributed some samples. So it's time takes to change the decision. But if you are not able to convince decision makers, look for different decision makers. So hire Angelina Jolie to promote your test. It's called a marketing ambassador. That's also a possibility. In biotech startup, it is also critical to publish, not only to have patents. Patents are needed if you are talking to an investor, but publications are very important for the success of biotechnology startup. And also have fun. If you don't have fun from running startup projects, then don't do it. And one final take-home message, but I'm not going to explain into details. Some dreams are at left, just dreams. Okay, so back to my career. eventually you have, at some point, you have to make some decisions. So this is my line, and this is where I have to make a decision where to go. I was approached by our dean and the faculty to become a dean, where you then cannot do anything else, and definitely you cannot be part of some company. And but still, I have some startup plans with our younger generation, bioinformaticians and molecular biologists. And there is also some possibility, some approach from companies. So when you are a certain age, you eventually have to make decisions. But up to this level, try your startup. Try a startup.
Okay. With enough experience. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Questions?
Go back to the previous question. No, the one. Some take-home message. We're going to refer in the list. I mean, you have to say. Somebody wants to say?
Who wants to openly
I mean,
say
you have
that?
to rate